When the stagecoach door opened in that New Mexico dust, Caleb Monroe expected one woman, the bride he'd written to for 6 months. What he got was two. Eleanor Wright stepped down first, then turned back to help her trembling mother descend. The crowd went silent. Every pair of eyes swung to Caleb, waiting for him to do what any sensible man would: send them back. He'd paid for one ticket, made promises for one future. But when Eleanor met his gaze, proud, exhausted, braced for rejection, something shifted in his chest. This wasn't the bargain. But maybe it was exactly what his empty ranch needed. If you're ready to discover how one unexpected choice changed 3 lives forever, stay with me until the end. And please, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The August sun beat down on the wooden platform like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air thick and shimmering. Caleb Monroe stood apart from the small cluster of townspeople gathered at the stage stop, his hat pulled low against the glare, his hands steady at his sides despite the riot happening inside his chest. 6 months of letters. 6 months of careful words exchanged across 1,000 miles. 6 months of imagining this moment. The stagecoach was late, had been for nearly an hour, and the wait had drawn spectators the way blood draws flies. Mrs. Kimball from the Mercantile whispered behind her hand to Sarah Chen, the baker's wife. Tom Garrett, who owned the saloon, leaned against the post with his arms crossed and a smirk playing at his mouth. Even Reverend Phillips had found reason to pause his afternoon rounds, Bible tucked under one arm, curiosity playing on his weathered face. They'd all heard about Caleb's arrangement. In a town of 300 souls, there were no secrets. "Figure she'll be pretty," Tom called out, not bothering to lower his voice. "All them letters you've been writing, she better be worth the ink." Caleb didn't answer. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave that morning. Let them talk. Let them speculate. In a few minutes, Eleanor Wright would step off that coach, and whatever happened next would be between the two of them. Nobody else. The sound reached them before the sight. The thunder of hooves, the creak and groan of wood and leather, the driver's shout carrying across the flats. Then the coach itself appeared, a dark shape swimming through the heat waves, growing more solid with each second until it rolled to a stop in a cloud of pale dust that coated everything, everyone. "Whoa! Whoa! There!" The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been running this route for 20 years, set the brake and climbed down with the stiffness of someone who'd spent too many hours on a hard seat. He opened the door without ceremony, and Caleb's world narrowed to that single black rectangle. A hand appeared first, slender, ungloved, gripping the doorframe. Then a boot, practical, worn at the heel, found the step. The woman who emerged wasn't what Caleb had pictured, but then again, he'd learned long ago that imagination was a poor substitute for reality. Eleanor Wright was tall, nearly as tall as he was, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot and eyes that scanned the crowd with something that looked like wariness. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better days, the fabric dusty from the journey, and she moved with a deliberate grace that spoke of someone who'd learned to carry herself with care. Their eyes met, held. Caleb took a step forward, his throat suddenly dry. "Miss Wright? Mr. Monroe?" Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steadier. She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. "Thank you for—" She turned back to the coach, and Caleb's words died unspoken. Another hand reached out from the darkness inside, this one trembling, the skin thin as paper over delicate bones. Eleanor grasped it gently, murmuring something he couldn't hear, and helped a second woman descend. The older woman who stepped down moved like someone navigating the deck of a ship in a storm, each movement uncertain, her breathing audible even from where Caleb stood. She was small, impossibly frail, her hair white as alkali, and her face carved with lines that spoke of hard years and harder losses. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same bone structure, the same set to the mouth. Eleanor's mother. The whispers started immediately, a hiss of sound that crawled up Caleb's spine. That ain't what he agreed to. Bringing her mother? Who does she think? Send them right back on the next stage, if he's got any sense. Caleb stood frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't the arrangement. The letters had said nothing about a mother, nothing about anyone else. One ticket, one bride, one future carefully negotiated across the distance between loneliness and hope. Eleanor helped her mother to the platform, keeping one arm around the older woman's waist. Only then did she lift her chin and meet Caleb's gaze directly, and what he saw there hit him like a fist to the chest. Pride, shame, defiance, fear. She knew. She knew this wasn't what he'd expected, knew the crowd was watching, knew he had every right to refuse. But beneath all of it, threading through the complex tapestry of emotions in those dark eyes, was something else. Desperation. Not the desperate scrambling of someone caught in a lie, but the quiet, bone-deep desperation of someone who'd run out of options and knew it. "Mr. Monroe?" Eleanor said again, and this time her voice carried the faintest tremor. "This is my mother, Catherine Wright. She paused, swallowed. "I should have told you, but I was afraid if I did, he wouldn't have, and he shouldn't now." Mrs. Kimball had moved closer, her face pinched with disapproval. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Monroe. Highly irregular. You made an agreement for one." "Mrs. Kimball," Caleb's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let Miss Wright finish speaking." The older woman's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes glittered with indignation. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, vultures circling, waiting to see what the sensible Caleb Monroe would do, waiting to see him do what propriety demanded. Eleanor's mother swayed slightly, and Eleanor's grip tightened. "Mama, maybe you should sit." "I'm fine, Eleanor." Catherine Wright's voice was thread-thin but firm. She lifted her head, and despite the obvious weakness in her body, there was steel in her spine. "Mr. Monroe, my daughter is right. She should have told you about me. The fault is mine. I insisted she write as though I didn't exist because I couldn't bear the thought of being the reason she lost this chance. But dishonesty is dishonesty, no matter the intention." She paused, her breathing labored. "We'll take the next stage back to Santa Fe. We won't impose on your kindness any—" "How long has it been since you ate?" The question surprised them all, Caleb included. But now that he'd asked it, he saw the answer written plainly in the hollows of Catherine's cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on her frame, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of more than just age. Eleanor began. "This morning," Catherine said, lifting her chin. "We ate this morning." It was a lie. Caleb had grown up around enough liars to recognize one, even when the lie came wrapped in dignity. He looked from mother to daughter, seeing the same stubborn pride in both faces, the same refusal to beg even when begging might be the sensible thing. Behind him, Tom Garrett laughed, low and mean. "Hell, Monroe, you wanted a wife, not a charity case. Send them on and try again. Plenty more fish in that particular sea." Something hot and sharp moved through Caleb's chest. He'd spent the last 5 years building his ranch from nothing, turning hard ground and harder work into something that mattered. He'd buried his parents within a year of each other, learned to cook his own meals and mend his own clothes, and sleep in a house that echoed with emptiness. He'd written those letters to Eleanor because he was tired of being alone, because the silence had started to feel like a weight pressing down on his lungs. But he'd also written them because he remembered what it felt like to be desperate, to be at the mercy of other people's kindness or cruelty, to stand on the edge of everything falling apart and know that one wrong move, one rejection, would send you tumbling into the dark. "Pete." Caleb turned to the driver, who was watching the scene with the detached interest of someone who'd seen every kind of human drama play out on this platform. "You got their bags?" Pete blinked. "Well, yeah, but—" "Bring them down, please." Caleb looked back at Eleanor, at her mother, at the fear and hope warring in their expressions. "My wagon's just there. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. We can talk on the way." The silence that fell was absolute. Mrs. Kimball made a strangled sound. "Mr. Monroe, you cannot seriously be considering—" "I'm not considering anything." Caleb's voice came out flat, final. "I'm offering these ladies a ride to my ranch. What happens after that is between us and nobody else. But the agreement was between Miss Wright and myself." He met Eleanor's eyes. "Still is, as far as I'm concerned, unless the lady has changed her mind." Eleanor stared at him like he'd started speaking a language she didn't know. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. No, no, I haven't changed my mind. But Mr. Monroe, you don't have to. My mother could stay in town, find work somewhere. I'm sure Mrs. Kimball might know of. I won't. Mrs. Kimball's voice could have frozen whiskey. I certainly will not be party to this kind of deception. Then it's fortunate I'm not asking you to be. Caleb moved toward the wagon, trying to ignore the weight of all those eyes on his back. His hands were steady as he checked the harness, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. What the hell was he doing? He'd planned for one person, prepared for one future. Now he was taking on two strangers, one of them clearly ill, and turning his carefully negotiated arrangement into something else entirely. But when he glanced back and saw Eleanor helping her mother toward the wagon, saw the cautious hope beginning to replace the fear in her expression, he knew he couldn't have made any other choice. Pete brought down 2 battered carpet bags and a small trunk, grunting with the effort. That's everything, Miss Wright? Yes. Thank you. Eleanor's voice was quiet. She kept one hand on her mother's elbow, guiding her carefully across the uneven ground. Caleb took the trunk, surprised by its weight. Whatever they'd brought it all. He loaded it into the wagon bed, then turned to help Catherine up to the seat. I can manage, the older woman said, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the wheel. I'm sure you can, Mrs. Wright. Caleb kept his voice gentle. But I'd appreciate it if you'd let me help anyway. Been a long time since I had occasion to practice my manners. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Humor, maybe? Or just exhaustion finally winning out over pride. She let him lift her to the seat, and he was shocked by how little she weighed, how fragile she felt beneath his hands. Like a bird. Like something that might break if he wasn't careful. Eleanor climbed up beside her mother, settling the carpet bags at their feet. Caleb swung up to the driver's seat, aware of every person watching, every judgment being rendered in silence. Let them judge. He'd never been much good at caring what other people thought anyway. Mr. Monroe. He turned. Reverend Phillips had approached, his expression troubled. I hope you know what you're doing, son. So do I, Reverend. Caleb gathered the reins. So do I. He clicked his tongue and the horses moved forward, pulling the wagon away from the platform, away from the watching eyes and whispered judgments. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, already shaping the story they'd tell over dinner tables and in the saloon, already deciding what this meant. For the first mile, nobody spoke. The wagon rolled across the hard-packed earth, following the rutted track that led west toward the mountains. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, and the air smelled of sage and dust and the promise of cooler evening ahead. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, his hands loose on the reins, but he was intensely aware of the 2 women beside him. Catherine had closed her eyes, her head resting against Eleanor's shoulder, her breathing shallow and quick. Eleanor sat rigid, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. Finally, she spoke. Why? One word, but it contained multitudes. Caleb considered his answer carefully. Because sending you back seemed wrong. That's not a reason. That's an evasion. Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. You had every right to refuse. The agreement was for one person, and I brought 2. I deceived you, even if my intentions were... She stopped, swallowed. You don't know us. You don't know what you're taking on. No, Caleb agreed. I don't. My mother is ill, truly ill, not just tired from the journey. She needs care, Mr. Monroe. Medicine, rest, things that cost money and time and... Miss Wright. He glanced at her, saw the fear naked in her face now that the crowd couldn't see it. I'm not a rich man. My ranch does well enough, but it's not grand. The house is small, the work is hard, and I can't promise you comfort or ease. But I can promise you shelter for both of you, at least for now. At least for now, Eleanor repeated softly. And then? And then we figure out what comes next. Together, if you're willing, separately, if you're not. Caleb turned his attention back to the road. But either way, you're not getting back on that stage tonight, or tomorrow. Not until your mother has had a chance to recover her strength. Silence again. longer this time. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice had changed. Some of the brittleness had softened into something that might have been gratitude. I wrote to 17 men before you answered, Mr. Monroe. 17. Most never responded. 3 wrote back to say they weren't interested. 2 made offers that were unsuitable. You were the only one who wrote like a human being, like someone who actually wanted a partner, not a servant or a... She stopped herself. I should have told you about my mother. I wanted to. Every letter, I thought, this time I'll tell him. But I was afraid if I did, you'd stop writing, and I couldn't bear the thought of that silence again. Caleb heard the loneliness in those words, recognized it because it echoed his own. How many nights had he sat at his kitchen table, lamp burning low, trying to find the right words to convince a stranger that he was worth taking a chance on? How many times had he nearly given up, nearly resigned himself to the silence? I'm not much of a talker, he said. Never have been. But I'm a decent listener, and I keep my word when I give it. I told you in my letters that I was looking for a partner, someone to build a life with. That hasn't changed. Even though I'm not what you expected? Are you what you expected to be when you decided to answer advertisements for a mail-order bride? Eleanor let out a breath that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. No, I suppose not. The land opened up before them as they rode, rolling hills giving way to flatter ground dotted with pinon and juniper. In the distance, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose like a wall of stone, their peaks still dusted with last winter's snow despite the August heat. It was harsh country, unforgiving country, but there was a beauty to it that Caleb had come to love. The way the light changed with every hour, the vast silence broken only by wind and birdsong, the sense of space that let a man breathe. Tell me about your ranch, Eleanor said suddenly. The letters mentioned cattle and horses, but not much else. Caleb considered where to begin. It's about 200 acres, most of it grazing land. I've got a small herd, maybe 40 head of cattle, a dozen horses. The house is adobe, 2 rooms and a loft. There's a well that runs clean year-round and a creek that flows most seasons. I've got a barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar. He paused. It's not much, but it's mine. Built most of it with my own hands. That sounds like a great deal to me, Catherine said softly. Her eyes were open now, watching the landscape roll past. More than we've had in a long time. Eleanor's hand found her mother's, squeezed gently. Caleb saw the gesture out of the corner of his eye and felt something shift in his chest again. Whatever had happened to these women, whatever had driven them to this desperate journey across the country to marry a stranger, it had bound them together in a way that went deeper than blood. Can I ask what happened? The question came out before he could stop it. To bring you here, I mean. You don't have to answer if you'd rather not. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral, emptied of emotion. My father died 2 years ago. Influenza. He was a clerk in Boston, a good man, a careful man. He provided well for us, but when he died, we discovered that he'd made some poor investments toward the end. Trusted the wrong people with money we couldn't afford to lose. She paused. We tried to stay in Boston. I found work as a seamstress, and Mama took in washing when she was strong enough. But the city is expensive, and her health was failing. The doctor said the air was bad for her, said she needed someplace dry and warm. So you came west? So I came west. Mama was too weak to travel at first, so I went to Santa Fe alone, found work in a boarding house. Saved everything I could. When I'd saved enough for her ticket, I sent for her. Eleanor's voice dropped lower. But the work was... The owner of the boarding house made it clear that my position came with certain expectations. Expectations I wasn't willing to meet. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't need her to elaborate. He'd met enough men like that. Men who thought a woman without protection was fair game. So you wrote letters, he said. So I wrote letters. Eleanor looked at him directly. I told you I was looking for a fresh start. That was true. I told you I was tired of being alone. That was also true. What I didn't tell you was that I was desperate, that we were running out of money and options and time, that my mother's cough was getting worse and the medicine was expensive and the landlady had given us until the end of the month to pay what we owed. And you thought if I knew all that, I'd see you as a burden. Wouldn't you? The question was direct, almost challenging. Be honest, Mr. Monroe. If I'd written and said, I'm penniless, my mother is dying, and I need someone to save us, would you have written back? Caleb was quiet, letting the horses find their own pace. Would he have written back? He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe he was the kind of man who'd rise to that kind of need. But truthfully, he didn't know. He'd been looking for a partner, not a rescue mission. He'd wanted companionship, not obligation. I don't know, he admitted finally. Maybe not. But you didn't write that. You wrote about loving books and missing the ocean and wondering what the stars looked like in New Mexico. You wrote about wanting to grow a garden and learn to ride a horse and see what lay beyond the horizon. That's what I answered. That's who I thought I was writing to. That's still who I am, Eleanor said quietly. All those things were true too. I do love books. I do miss the ocean. I do want all those things, Mr. Monroe. I'm not just my desperation. No, Caleb agreed. I don't imagine you are. They rode in silence for a while longer. The sun was lower now, the shadows stretching long across the ground. Catherine had dozed off again, her slight weight leaning more heavily against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor adjusted her position to support her mother more comfortably, and Caleb found himself struck by the tenderness of the gesture, the way she moved so carefully, trying not to wake her. The ranch is just ahead, he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings barely visible in the gathering dusk. Another 10 minutes or so. Eleanor straightened slightly, peering into the distance. He tried to see it through her eyes. The low adobe house with its covered porch, the barn painted red by some long-ago owner, the corral with its split-rail fence. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even particularly pretty. But it was solid and well-maintained, and it had been home for 5 years. As they drew closer, Caleb found himself talking, filling the silence with details he hadn't planned to share. The house faces east to catch the morning sun. The roof doesn't leak, and the fireplace draws clean. I've got wood stacked for winter already, and the root cellar's full of preserves and dried goods. The bedroom is... He stopped, suddenly aware of the awkwardness. There was only one bedroom. He'd assumed he and his new wife would share it, but now, with her mother here. I can sleep in the loft, Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. Mama can have the bedroom, and I'll make do upstairs. I'm sure you have extra blankets. I do, Caleb said, grateful she'd solved the problem without him having to stumble through it. But the loft gets cold at night, even in summer, and there's only one bed in the bedroom. I'll sleep in the barn. It's comfortable enough, and I've done it before when... He stopped himself before he could say, when I was too drunk to make it to the house, which had happened more times than he cared to admit in the first year after his parents died. Mr. Monroe, I cannot possibly... You can, and you will. At least for tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out a better arrangement, but tonight your mother needs proper rest, and so do you. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. Besides, I need to check on the horses anyway. One of the mares is due to foal any day now, and I like to keep close when that happens. He climbed down and came around to help Catherine descend. She was awake now, blinking owlishly at the house, and when her feet touched the ground, she swayed so hard Caleb had to catch her to keep her from falling. Mama! Eleanor scrambled down, her face pale with worry. I'm fine, Catherine murmured, but she leaned heavily on Caleb's arm. Just dizzy. It'll pass. It didn't pass. By the time they got her inside and settled on the narrow bed in the bedroom, Catherine was gray-faced and struggling for breath. Caleb lit the lamp while Eleanor knelt beside her mother, smoothing the white hair back from her forehead, murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow even to his ears. Does she have medicine? Caleb asked. Yes. In the smaller carpet bag. Brown bottle, third from the left. Eleanor didn't look up. 2 spoonfuls mixed with water. Caleb found the bag, found the bottle. The label was worn but readable. Laudanum. He'd seen enough of it to know what it meant. Pain medication. Which meant Catherine Wright was in more trouble than simple weakness or fatigue. He mixed the dose carefully, brought it to Eleanor. She coaxed her mother into swallowing it, then sat back on her heels, her shoulders slumping. How long has she been like this? Caleb asked quietly. Months. Since last winter, really, but it's gotten worse. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. The doctor in Santa Fe said it was consumption. Said there wasn't much to be done except keep her comfortable and hope the climate helped. But the medicine is expensive, and without it, she... Her voice broke. I couldn't watch her suffer. I couldn't. Caleb looked at the woman on the bed, at her labored breathing and wasted frame, and felt the weight of what he'd taken on settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't just offering shelter to a mail-order bride who'd brought unexpected company. This was agreeing to watch a woman die, because that's what consumption meant. Maybe not today, maybe not this month, but eventually. Inevitably. He should send them back. The sensible thing, the smart thing, would be to put them on the next stage and wash his hands of the whole situation before he got in any deeper. He hadn't signed up for this, hadn't agreed to any of it. But when he looked at Eleanor, at the exhaustion and grief and desperate hope warring in her expression, he couldn't make himself say the words that would send them away. There's stew on the stove, he said instead. It's probably cold by now, but I can heat it up. You should eat something. I'm not hungry. Miss Wright. He waited until she looked at him. When's the last time you ate? And don't tell me this morning because I know that was a lie when your mother said it. Eleanor's chin lifted, that same stubborn pride he'd seen at the stage stop. But then something crumbled behind her eyes, and she looked away. Yesterday, she admitted. Yesterday afternoon. We had bread and cheese at the last way station. 24 hours. No wonder she looked ready to collapse. Caleb stood, moving toward the door. I'll heat the stew. You'll eat. Your mother's resting now, and you sitting here starving yourself won't help her or anyone else. Mr. Monroe, Caleb. He paused in the doorway, glanced back. If we're going to share a roof, even temporarily, you might as well call me by my name. Caleb. Eleanor tested the word, and something about hearing it in her voice made his chest tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. Thank you for all of this. I know it's not what you expected, and I know I have no right to ask for your kindness, but you're not asking, Caleb interrupted gently. I'm offering. There's a difference. He left before she could argue, closing the door quietly behind him. The main room was dim, lit only by the fading light through the windows. He moved through it by memory, lighting another lamp, stirring the fire in the stove back to life. The stew was in a pot on the back burner where he'd left it that morning. Venison and vegetables, simple but filling. He set it to heat, then stood looking around the room, trying to see it through Eleanor's eyes. It was clean, at least. He'd spent the last week scrubbing and organizing, wanting to make a good impression. The table was handmade but solid. The chairs matched, more or less. There were shelves with his small collection of books, a few dishes on the counter, curtains his mother had made years ago still hanging at the windows. It was the home of a man who lived alone, who'd learned to make do with what he had, but it wasn't shameful. It wasn't unwelcoming. But it also wasn't ready for 3 people. Wasn't ready for a dying woman and her desperate daughter. Wasn't ready for any of this. Caleb ran a hand over his face, suddenly tired to his bones. What the hell was he doing? He'd wanted a partner, a companion, someone to share the work and the silence with. He'd wanted to stop eating alone, sleeping alone, waking to empty rooms. He'd wanted something to fill the hollow place his parents' deaths had left behind. He hadn't wanted this complication, this weight of responsibility, this impossible situation with no good answers. But then he thought about Eleanor's face when she'd stepped off that stage, the pride and fear and desperate hope. He thought about Catherine Wright's trembling hands and labored breath, the way she'd tried so hard to maintain her dignity even as her body betrayed her. He thought about the crowd at the stage stop, about Tom Garrett's cruel laughter and Mrs. Kimball's pinched disapproval, about how easy it would have been to join them in their judgment. He'd made his choice. Right or wrong, foolish or wise, he'd made it the moment he'd asked Pete to bring down their bags. Now he had to live with it. The stew began to bubble, filling the air with rich, savory steam. Caleb found 2 bowls, filled them, cut thick slices of bread from the loaf he'd baked 2 days ago. He arranged everything on a tray, along with water and coffee, then carried it back to the bedroom. Eleanor was still kneeling beside her mother's bed, but her head had dropped forward, her eyes closed. She'd fallen asleep there, her hand still resting on Catherine's arm. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of both women's breathing, the way the lamplight softened their features and painted shadows on the wall. Then he set the tray down quietly on the small table beside the bed and left them to their rest. Outside, the stars were beginning to emerge, hard, bright points in a darkening sky. Caleb walked to the barn, checking on the animals, doing the evening chores by muscle memory. The pregnant mare nickered at him from her stall, and he gave her an extra measure of grain, running his hand along her swollen belly. "Soon," he murmured. "Any day now. New life coming into the world." The thought should have pleased him, but tonight it felt heavy, weighted with all the uncertainty that had walked through his door in the shape of two exhausted women. He finished his work, banked the fire in the small stove he kept in the barn for cold nights, and made himself a rough bed in the tack room using horse blankets and his saddle as a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. And somehow, despite everything, the upheaval, the uncertainty, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring questions he didn't know how to answer, sleep came quickly. In the house, Eleanor woke with a start, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was dark except for the lamp burning low on the table. Beside it sat a tray of food, still warm enough to steam slightly in the cool air. Her mother was sleeping deeply, her breath more even than it had been in days, and Eleanor realized the laudanum had finally taken hold. She rose stiffly, her knees aching from kneeling so long on the hard floor. The stew smelled incredible, and her stomach cramped with sudden, fierce hunger. She picked up the bowl, intending to eat just a few bites, but once she started, she couldn't stop. She ate everything, sopping up the last of the gravy with the bread, then drank the water in long, grateful gulps. Only when she was finished did she let herself look around the room properly. It was spare but well made, with thick adobe walls that would hold heat in winter and stay cool in summer. The bed was narrow but sturdy, the blankets clean and smelling faintly of sage. There was a chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small mirror on the wall. A man's room, built for function rather than comfort, but cared for nonetheless. Through the window, she could see the barn, a dark shape against the starlit sky. Somewhere in there, Caleb Monroe was sleeping on a bed of horse blankets because he'd given up his room for two strangers, because he'd seen them at their most desperate and vulnerable and hadn't turned away. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb her mother. The events of the day crashed over her all at once. The terror of stepping off that stage and seeing the crowd's judgment, the moment when she'd been certain Caleb would send them back, the impossible relief when he'd asked for their bags instead. The way he'd caught her mother when she stumbled, the gentleness in his rough hands, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd silenced Mrs. Kimball's objections. She didn't know this man, didn't know if his kindness was genuine or just the result of being backed into a corner by circumstance and witnesses, didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after, or any of the days stretching ahead into an uncertain future. But tonight, for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something that might have been hope. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and juniper through the open window. In the barn, a horse whinnied softly, and beneath it all, steady as a heartbeat, was the vast silence of the New Mexico night, holding them all in its ancient, indifferent embrace. Eleanor lay down beside her mother, fully clothed, too exhausted to do anything else. She pulled the blanket over them both and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, they had shelter, they had food, they had a chance. It was more than they'd had when they'd stepped off that stage, more than she'd dared to hope for. And somehow, impossibly, it was enough. Morning came with the smell of coffee and something else Eleanor couldn't immediately place. Wood smoke, maybe, or the clean scent of hay carried on the wind. She woke slowly, disoriented by the quality of light slanting through unfamiliar windows, by the weight of her mother's hand still clasped in her own. For one confused moment, she thought she was back in the boarding house in Santa Fe that yesterday had been nothing but an anxious dream. Then she heard the sound of footsteps outside, the low murmur of a man's voice speaking to animals, and reality settled back into place with the weight of stone. She was in New Mexico, in Caleb Monroe's house, having arrived with her dying mother and no real plan beyond hoping this stranger would be kinder than the world had been. And somehow, impossibly, he had been. Catherine was still sleeping, her breathing easier than it had been in weeks. The laudanum had given her the first genuine rest she'd had since leaving Santa Fe, and Eleanor was reluctant to wake her. She eased her hand free carefully and stood, smoothing down her wrinkled traveling dress, aware of how she must look, rumpled, unwashed, her hair falling loose from yesterday's pins. The main room was empty but showed signs of recent occupation. The stove was warm, a pot of coffee sitting on it, steam rising in lazy spirals. 2 cups sat on the table beside a covered plate. When Eleanor lifted the cloth, she found fresh biscuits, still warm, and a jar of honey. He'd been in here. While she slept, Caleb had come into the house, made breakfast, left it for her, and gone back out without waking her. The consideration of it, the quiet thoughtfulness, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She poured herself coffee, added honey to one of the biscuits, and stood at the window eating slowly, watching the man who'd upended her expectations move through his morning routine. He was taller than she'd realized yesterday, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. He moved with economy, no wasted motion, carrying water from the well to the horse trough, forking hay into the corral, pausing to run his hand along the neck of a chestnut mare who lipped at his shirt pocket looking for treats. There was something steady about him, something that reminded her of good oak, solid, reliable, built to last. But there was also something lonely in the set of his shoulders, the way he spoke to the animals as though they were his only company, which, she supposed, they had been until yesterday. The door opened behind her, and Eleanor turned quickly, heat rising to her cheeks at being caught watching him. But it was Catherine who stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her white hair loose around her shoulders. "Eleanor? Where—" She stopped, taking in the room, the window, her daughter's guilty expression. "Oh, we're still here." "We're still here," Eleanor confirmed. She crossed quickly to her mother, guiding her to one of the chairs. "Mama, you should be resting. The doctor said a great many things, most of them expensive and few of them helpful." Catherine sank into the chair with a sigh that came from somewhere deep, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been yesterday, and when Eleanor pressed the back of her hand to her mother's forehead, the fever that had been a constant companion for months was blessedly absent. "I feel better this morning, truly. Whatever was in that medicine, it helped." Eleanor poured her mother coffee, buttered a biscuit, tried not to think about how many doses were left in that brown bottle, or how much it would cost to get more. One crisis at a time. That's what her father used to say when things got difficult. One crisis at a time, Eleanor. Don't borrow tomorrow's troubles when today has plenty of its own. "He seems kind," Catherine said quietly, her gaze drifting to the window where Caleb was visible in the corral. "Mr. Monroe, the way he helped me yesterday, the way he didn't—" She paused, swallowed. "The way he didn't send us back. That was kind." It was, Eleanor agreed, but kindness had limits, and she knew better than most how quickly charity could sour into resentment when the burden proved heavier than expected. "But, Mama, we can't impose on him. This wasn't the arrangement. We need to find another solution." "What solution?" Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "We have $43 between us. The room in Santa Fe cost us $8 a week. The medicine is $5 a bottle. Even if I could work, which we both know I can't, we'd be destitute within a month. Less, probably." Eleanor looked down at her coffee, watching the surface ripple with the tremor in her hands. Her mother was right. They'd played their last card when Eleanor had written to Caleb Monroe, when she'd stepped onto that stagecoach with her mother's frail weight leaning against her shoulder and a prayer that the man on the other end of those careful letters would be as decent as his words suggested. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We accept his hospitality," Catherine said, "with grace and gratitude. We make ourselves useful, and we see what comes next." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened and Caleb stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of horses and hay and morning air. He stopped when he saw them both at the table, something crossing his face too quickly to read. "Mrs. Wright," he said, nodding to Catherine, "you're looking better this morning." "I feel better, Mr. Monroe. Thank you for the medicine and for—" Catherine gestured around the room, encompassing everything. For all of this. It's Caleb, he said, the same thing he told Eleanor last night. And you're welcome. He moved to the stove, poured himself coffee, then stood holding the cup like he wasn't quite sure what to do with his hands. The silence stretched awkward and uncertain until finally he cleared his throat. I was thinking, if you're both feeling up to it, I could show you around the place this morning. Help you get your bearings, unless you'd rather rest longer. I'd like that, Eleanor said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. If it's not too much trouble. No trouble. Caleb drained his coffee in 2 long swallows, set the cup down. I've got a few things to finish up in the barn first. Maybe give you time to... He gestured vaguely. There's water in the pitcher in the bedroom. Clean towels in the trunk. Take your time. He left quickly, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite everything. For a man who lived alone, Caleb Monroe seemed profoundly uncomfortable with actual human company in his house. He's nervous, Catherine observed, the corners of her mouth lifting. How unexpected. Mama? What? I'm simply noting that your Mr. Monroe, who was so calm and steady yesterday in front of that horrible crowd, seems to have no idea what to do with 2 women at his breakfast table. He's not my Mr. Monroe, Eleanor protested, but the words felt strange in her mouth. Technically, he was supposed to be. That had been the agreement. She would come west. They would marry. They would build a life together. Simple. Straightforward. Except now nothing was simple, and the straightforward path had twisted into something she couldn't see the end of. She helped her mother back to the bedroom, then took the opportunity to wash properly for the first time since leaving Santa Fe. The water was cold but clean, and she used it sparingly, scrubbing away 2 days of travel dust and fear sweat. She changed into her other dress, dove gray instead of traveling brown, nearly as worn but cleaner, and did her best to tame her hair into something respectable. When she emerged, Caleb was waiting by the door, his hat in his hands. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, then he looked away quickly, color rising above his collar. You look... He started, then stopped. Ready. You look ready. Eleanor bit back a smile, nervous indeed. Mama needs to rest a bit longer, but I'm eager to see the ranch. If that's all right. Of course. He opened the door for her, and they stepped out into morning sunshine that was already warm with the promise of August heat. We'll start with the barn, I think. I want to check on Rosie. That's the mare I mentioned last night. She's close to foaling, and I like to keep an eye on her. They walked side by side across the hard-packed earth toward the barn, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of everything, the way their shadows moved together on the ground, the careful distance he maintained between them, the sound of his boots and her shoes creating an uneven rhythm. She searched for something to say, some way to break the silence that didn't feel weighted with all the unspoken questions hanging between them. How long have you had the ranch? She asked finally. 5 years? My parents homesteaded the land 20 years ago, built the original house, started the herd. When they passed, I inherited it. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor heard the grief underneath, old but still sharp. I was 23. Didn't know much about ranching beyond what they'd taught me growing up. Had to learn the rest the hard way. That must have been difficult. It was. Caleb pushed open the barn door, and the dimness inside was a relief after the bright sun. But hard work is good for grief, I found. Gives you something to do with your hands when your mind won't settle. Eleanor understood that too well. After her father died, she'd sewn until her fingers bled, taking in any work she could find, because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning in the reality of everything they'd lost. The barn was well-maintained, clean-swept, with organized tack hanging from wooden pegs and hay stacked neatly in the loft. 6 stalls lined one wall, 3 of them occupied. Caleb led her to the end stall where a chestnut mare stood, her belly distended with late pregnancy. This is Rosie, he said, his voice softening as he opened the stall door. The mare nickered and moved toward him, bumping his chest with her nose. Easy, girl. I know you're uncomfortable. Won't be much longer now. He ran his hands over her sides with practiced competence, checking her udder, examining her flanks. Eleanor watched, fascinated by the gentleness in those work-roughened hands, the way he murmured reassurance to the anxious animal. Have you delivered foals before? She asked. A few dozen over the years. It's usually straightforward if you don't panic and you know what to look for. He straightened, gave Rosie a final pat. She's a good mama. This'll be her fourth foal. The last three were strong and healthy, sold for good prices. Is that what you do? Raise horses? Horses and cattle both. The cattle provide steady income. I sell beef to the fort and to some of the mining camps up north. But the horses are what I love. He moved to the next stall where a gray gelding pushed his head over the door, demanding attention. This is Smoke. He's getting old now, probably has another year or two of good work left, but he's earned his rest. I'll never sell him. Eleanor reached out tentatively, and the horse snuffled at her palm, his breath warm and hay-sweet. I've never been this close to a horse before. In Boston, we saw them on the streets, of course, but we never— She stopped herself. I suppose that sounds foolish to you. Not foolish, Caleb said. Just different. Everyone starts somewhere. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. Would you like to learn? To ride, I mean. I could teach you if you wanted. The offer surprised her. You'd do that? Why not? If you're going to live out here, even temporarily, knowing how to handle a horse is practical. And— He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. And you wrote in one of your letters that you wanted to learn. I remember that. He remembered. Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest, dangerous and hopeful in equal measure. I did write that. I thought it seemed like something that would be useful. Out here, I mean, where everything is so spread out. It's not just useful, Caleb said quietly. It's freedom. Being able to saddle a horse and ride wherever you want to go, not having to depend on stages or wagons or anyone else. That's a kind of freedom most people never have. Eleanor thought about the last 2 years of her life, trapped first by her father's debts, then by her mother's illness, then by the expectations of men like the boarding house owner who'd thought he could buy her compliance with threats and promises. The idea of freedom, of being able to move through the world on her own terms, was intoxicating. I'd like that, she said. To learn, I mean. If you're truly willing to teach me. I am. Caleb's mouth curved in something that might have been a smile, though it was small and uncertain, like he was out of practice. We'll start simple. Maybe tomorrow, if your mother doesn't need you. They continued through the barn, Caleb pointing out the milk cow, the chickens in their coop, the various tools and equipment that kept a ranch running. He explained the rhythm of ranch work, the early mornings and late evenings, the seasonal cycles of calving and branding and harvest. Eleanor listened, trying to absorb it all, trying to imagine herself as part of this life rather than just a temporary visitor passing through. When they emerged back into the sunlight, Caleb gestured toward a fenced area behind the barn. Vegetable gardens there. It's pretty well established. Tomatoes, squash, beans, corn. I'm not much of a gardener, truth be told. I plant things and they grow or they don't, and I don't fuss over them much. But I keep it weeded and watered, and it produces enough to see me through winter. Eleanor walked to the fence, looking at the neat rows with a gardener's eye. Her mother had kept a small plot behind their Boston house, and Eleanor had learned young the satisfaction of coaxing life from soil. These plants were healthy but neglected. They'd benefit from proper attention, from someone who understood what they needed beyond simple survival. I could help with this, she said. If you'd like. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to make a difference. I'd appreciate that, Caleb said. Like I said, I keep them alive, but that's about all I manage. They walked the perimeter of the property next, Caleb showing her the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the spring pasture where the cattle grazed, the line of cottonwoods that marked the edge of his land. The ranch was larger than Eleanor had imagined, the work more complex, the isolation more complete. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles south, Caleb told her. The town was 12 miles east. In winter, when the snows came, he sometimes went weeks without seeing another human being. Doesn't it get lonely? Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. Yes, he said finally. That's why I wrote those letters, why I went through with the whole mail-order bride arrangement, even though half the town thought I was crazy. He glanced at her sideways. I got tired of talking to horses and cattle, started to forget what it felt like to have someone answer back. The honesty of it caught Eleanor off guard. She'd expected deflection, maybe humor, but not this raw admission of need. "I understand that," she said softly. "After my father died, after we lost everything, I felt like I was disappearing. Like if I didn't find something to hold on to, some reason to keep going, I'd just—" She made a helpless gesture. "Fade away entirely." "Is that why you wrote to me? To find something to hold on to?" "Yes. And no." Eleanor struggled to find the right words. "I needed practical help. That's true. But I also needed—" She paused, surprised by the emotion rising in her throat. "I needed to believe that somewhere in the world there was still kindness, still the possibility of something better. Your letters gave me that. Even if this hadn't worked out, even if you'd sent us back yesterday, those letters would have been worth it, because they reminded me that not everyone is cruel." Caleb stopped walking, turned to face her fully. His eyes were gray, she realized, the color of storm clouds over the mountains. "Eleanor," he said, and hearing her given name in his rough voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I need you to understand something. Yesterday, when I offered you both shelter, I did it because it seemed right. But I didn't think it through, didn't consider what it meant, what I was really taking on." He paused, his jaw working. "Your mother is seriously ill, I can see that. And you're here because you had nowhere else to go. Those are facts, and I'm not judging them. But I need to know, do you want to be here? Or are you just making the best of a bad situation?" The question hung between them, sharp and necessary. Eleanor could have lied, could have told him what he might want to hear, but something about the directness of his gaze demanded honesty in return. "I don't know," she admitted. "Yesterday I was terrified. Terrified you'd turn us away. Terrified of what would happen if you didn't. I haven't had time to think about want, Caleb. I've been too busy trying to survive." She met his eyes steadily. "But I meant what I wrote in those letters. About wanting a fresh start. About being tired of being alone. That was true. And if you're asking whether I'm willing to stay, willing to try to make this work, yes, I am. But only if you are too. I won't trap you into something you don't want out of pity or obligation." "It's not pity," Caleb said immediately. "I don't do things out of pity. If I did, I'd have married Grace Kimball 2 years ago when she made it clear she was interested, just because her mother was pressuring her and the whole town expected it." Despite everything, Eleanor felt a small spike of something that might have been jealousy. Grace Kimball? The woman from yesterday? Her daughter. About your age, pretty enough, good family. Mrs. Kimball thought we'd be a perfect match. Caleb's expression was wry. But Grace and I had nothing to say to each other beyond pleasantries. I tried, thinking maybe that was enough, but it wasn't. I'd rather be lonely than spend my life making conversation with someone I have nothing in common with. "And you think we have something in common?" Eleanor asked. "We've known each other less than a day." "We've known each other 6 months, Caleb corrected, "just not in person. Those letters, I meant what I wrote to Eleanor, about wanting a partner, about building something with someone who wanted to be here. The circumstances have changed, I'll grant you that. But the wanting hasn't." They stood facing each other in the August sunshine, the land spreading out around them in all directions, vast and empty and full of possibility. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, understood that what happened next would set the course for everything that followed. "So what do we do?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed to her mother that morning. "We take it slow," Caleb said. "We get to know each other properly, not through letters but in person. We see if what we wrote about wanting is something we actually have when we're sharing the same space, breathing the same air, and—" He paused, his expression softening. "And we take care of your mother, together, for however long she has." The tears came without warning, hot and sudden, spilling down Eleanor's cheeks before she could stop them. It was the relief of it, she realized, the profound relief of not having to carry everything alone anymore, of having someone say, "together," and mean it. "I'm sorry," she managed, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "I don't usually—" "Don't apologize." Caleb's voice was gentle. "You've been holding yourself together for a long time, I think. It's all right to let go sometimes." They walked back to the house in companionable silence. Something settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not love, It was far too early for that. But maybe the beginning of trust. Maybe the foundation upon which something stronger could be built. Catherine was awake when they returned, sitting at the table with one of Caleb's books open in front of her. She looked up as they entered, and Eleanor saw her mother's sharp eyes take in her tear-stained face, the careful distance between her and Caleb, the new ease in both their postures. "Did you have a good tour?" Catherine asked mildly. "Very good," Eleanor said. "Caleb's going to teach me to ride." "How wonderful!" Catherine's smile was genuine. "Your father always said every woman should know how to handle a horse, said it gave a person dignity, being able to travel under their own power." The afternoon passed quietly. Caleb returned to his work, checking fences and moving cattle to fresh pasture. Eleanor worked in the garden, weeding and watering, her hands remembering the rhythm of this kind of labor. Catherine sat in the shade of the porch, mending one of Caleb's shirts that she'd found with a torn seam, her needle moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd been sewing her whole life. When evening came, Caleb showed Eleanor how to milk the cow, his hands guiding hers through the unfamiliar motion. She was clumsy at first, squeezing too hard, and then too soft, but eventually found the rhythm. The milk came in warm streams, filling the pail with satisfying speed. "You're a natural," Caleb said, and Eleanor glowed with the praise like a child. They ate dinner together, roasted chicken and vegetables from the garden, fresh bread that Caleb had somehow found time to bake. The conversation was easier now, flowing around topics both safe and slightly dangerous. Catherine told stories about Eleanor's childhood in Boston, and Eleanor found herself laughing at memories she'd half forgotten. Caleb contributed less but listened more, his attention focused and genuine in a way that made Eleanor feel seen. After dinner, as the light faded and the stars began to emerge, Caleb stood and stretched. "I'll take first watch with Rosie tonight. That mare's getting close, and I don't want to miss it if she starts laboring." "Can I help?" Eleanor asked impulsively. "I've never seen a birth before, animal or human. I'd like to learn, if you don't mind the company." Caleb looked surprised, but pleased. "I don't mind, but it might be a long night. Could be hours, could be days still." "I don't mind either." Catherine shooed them both out, insisting she was perfectly capable of putting herself to bed. Eleanor grabbed a shawl against the cooling air and followed Caleb to the barn, where he'd already set up a small camp, blankets spread on clean hay, a lantern burning low, a bucket of water and clean rags standing ready. They settled in to wait, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, watching Rosie pace her stall with growing restlessness. Caleb talked in low tones about what to watch for, what the different signs meant, how to know when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. "Most of the time, they don't need help," he said. "Horses have been having foals for thousands of years without humans fussing over them. But sometimes things go wrong, and then you need to act fast." "Are you afraid?" Eleanor asked. "When things go wrong?" "Terrified," Caleb admitted. "Every time. I've lost 3 foals and 1 mare in 5 years. Each one felt like a failure, like if I'd just been smarter or quicker or better somehow, I could have saved them." He was quiet for a moment. "But you can't save everything. Sometimes all you can do is try your best and accept that your best isn't always enough." Eleanor thought about her father, about the months of watching him fade while she tried everything, doctors, medicines, prayers that went unanswered. She thought about her mother now, about the inevitable outcome that hovered over them like a shadow. "It's hard," she said quietly. "Accepting that you can't save someone you love." "The hardest thing there is," Caleb agreed. He looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor felt the weight of his understanding. "Is that what you're facing, with your mother?" "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "The doctor in Santa Fe was kind enough to be honest. He said 6 months, maybe a year, if we're lucky. Said the medicine would help with the pain but wouldn't cure anything. Said all we could do was make her comfortable and—" Her voice broke. "And say goodbye." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness, his palm rough and warm, his grip steady. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." "I'm not alone anymore," Eleanor said, and squeezed his hand back. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching Rosie pace and paw at the straw. Around midnight, the mare's water broke, and Caleb straightened, suddenly alert. "Here we go," he murmured. The birth was messy and primal and beautiful in a way Eleanor hadn't expected. Caleb moved with quiet confidence, checking the foal's position, guiding when needed, but mostly letting Rosie do the work herself. Within 20 minutes, a wet, gangly creature lay in the straw, and Rosie was turning to nuzzle her baby with fierce, protective love. "A colt," Caleb said, satisfaction clear in his voice. "Strong and healthy by the look of him." Eleanor watched, transfixed, as the foal struggled to stand on impossibly long legs, falling and trying again with determination that seemed almost human. Life, she thought. New life coming into the world even as other lives prepared to leave it. There was something profound in that, something that felt like a promise or a prayer. "Thank you," she said to Caleb, "for letting me see this." "Thank you for wanting to," he replied. They walked back to the house together as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. At the door, Caleb paused, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he said, "I know this isn't what either of us planned. The situation with your mother, the complications, all of it. But Eleanor, I'm glad you're here, both of you. This house has been too quiet for too long." "I'm glad we're here too," Eleanor said, and realized with surprise that she meant it. Inside, she found her mother already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of tea. Catherine took one look at Eleanor's face, dirt-smudged and radiant, and smiled. "Good night?" she asked. Rosie had her foal, a colt, perfect and healthy. Eleanor sank into the chair across from her mother. "Mama, I think this might work. I think we might actually be all right here." Catherine reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I think you might be right, my dear. I think you might be right." The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Eleanor with its naturalness. She woke each morning to the sound of Caleb moving through the house, building up the fire, putting coffee on to boil. By the time she emerged from the bedroom where she now slept beside her mother, Caleb had insisted, had refused every argument, he would be outside already, feeding animals, checking water troughs, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. She learned to make biscuits the way he liked them, with a touch of honey in the dough. He taught her to collect eggs without startling the hens, to recognize when the cow was ready for milking, to read the sky for signs of weather. Small skills, practical skills, but each one felt like a key unlocking a door she hadn't known was closed. Catherine grew stronger in those first weeks, or perhaps it was simply that the constant fear began to ease its grip. She took over the mending and most of the cooking, insisting that sitting idle made her feel useless. Eleanor would find her on the porch in the afternoons, her needle flashing in the sunlight, humming old songs from her girlhood in ways that made Eleanor's heart ache with bittersweet hope. But it was the writing lessons that changed everything. Caleb started her on Smoke, the old gray gelding who was patient with her clumsy mounting, her uncertain seat, her tendency to grip the reins too tightly. The first few days she barely made it beyond a walk around the corral, her legs trembling with the effort of staying balanced, her pride stinging each time she had to grab the saddle horn to keep from sliding off. "You're thinking too much," Caleb said on the 4th day, watching her make another awkward circuit. "Stop trying to control everything and just feel what the horse is doing. Let your body move with his." "Easy for you to say," Eleanor muttered, her knuckles white on the reins. "You've been riding since you could walk." "Since I was 5, actually, and I fell off so many times my mother threatened to tie me to the saddle." He moved closer to the fence, his arms resting on the top rail. "Falling is part of learning, Eleanor. You can't be so afraid of it that you never really ride." She wanted to argue that she wasn't afraid, but that would have been a lie. She was terrified, of falling, yes, but more of failing, of proving that she didn't belong here, couldn't adapt, would always be a city woman playing at frontier life. "What if I can't do this?" The words came out smaller than she'd intended. Caleb's expression softened. "Then we try something else." "But Eleanor, I've watched you learn to milk a cow in 3 days, learn to read weather signs in a week, learn to tell when Rosie's colt is hungry or tired or just playful. You're not someone who can't learn. You're someone who's afraid of looking foolish while she does." The observation hit closer than Eleanor wanted to admit. She'd spent so much of the last 2 years trying to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances, trying to prove she was worth more than the circumstances suggested. The thought of letting go of that control, even for something as simple as learning to ride, felt dangerous. But Caleb was watching her with something in his eyes that looked like belief. And Catherine was on the porch watching too, and something stubborn rose up in Eleanor's chest. "All right," she said. "Show me again. How to sit, how to move. All of it." He did, with a patience that never wavered even when she made the same mistakes repeatedly. And slowly, incrementally, something began to click. Her body started to understand what her mind had been fighting: the rhythm of the horse's movement, the way to shift her weight in response, the trust required to let the animal do what it was born to do. By the end of the second week, she could trot around the corral without bouncing painfully in the saddle. By the end of the third, Caleb opened the gate and led her out onto the open range. The first time she felt the wind in her face as Smoke moved from a trot to an easy canter, Eleanor understood what Caleb had meant about freedom. This was power and grace and possibility all rolled into one, the ability to move across the land at speeds her own legs could never match, to cover ground that would take hours to walk in mere minutes. She laughed aloud, pure joy bubbling up from somewhere deep, and heard Caleb laugh in response from where he rode beside her on a bay mare. "Now you've got it," he called over the thunder of hooves. "Now you're really riding." They rode for an hour that day, Caleb pointing out landmarks and boundaries, showing her the places where the land shifted from his property to his neighbor's, where the best grazing was, where the creek ran deepest. Eleanor absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, for understanding, for the sense of belonging that came with knowing a place intimately. When they finally turned back toward the ranch, she felt muscles she didn't know she had protesting, felt the pleasant exhaustion that comes from physical work well done. But more than that, she felt something settling into place inside her, a certainty that she could do this, could make a life here, could become the kind of woman who knew how to handle a horse and read the land and stand on her own 2 feet. That evening, after dinner, Caleb cleared his throat in a way that suggested he'd been building up to something. "There's a gathering this Saturday," he said, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. "At the Garrett place. Tom and his wife host one every month during summer, just neighbors getting together, sharing food, some music if anyone brings an instrument. I usually go for an hour or so." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing eventually she'd have to face the town again, face the people who'd watched Caleb make his choice at the stage stop and judge them both for it. "You want us to come with you?" she said quietly. "I'd like you to," Caleb corrected, "but only if you want to. I know it won't be comfortable, given—" He gestured vaguely. "Given everything, but people need to see that you're—" He stopped, frustrated with his own inability to articulate what he meant. "That we're respectable," Catherine finished gently. "That this arrangement, unusual as it is nevertheless proper and honorable." "Yes," Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. "Exactly that." Eleanor looked at her mother, saw the understanding in Catherine's eyes. This was part of the bargain, part of what it meant to try to build a life here. They couldn't hide on the ranch forever, couldn't avoid the community that Caleb was part of, and that they would need to be part of too, eventually. "We'll go," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "What should I expect?" "Nosy questions, mostly," Caleb said wryly. "Mrs. Kimball will try to corner you and extract every detail of our arrangement. Tom Garrett will make inappropriate jokes and drink too much. Sarah Chen will be kind because she's incapable of being otherwise. And everyone else will watch and whisper and try to figure out what's really happening here." "Lovely," Eleanor murmured. "It won't be easy," Caleb admitted. "But facing them together, showing them we're a united front, that'll help. And Eleanor," he paused, his gray eyes serious, "I won't let anyone disrespect you or your mother. Not at this gathering, not anywhere. You have my word on that." The certainty in his voice sent warmth through Eleanor's chest. "Thank you," she said softly. Saturday arrived with cloudless skies and heat that shimmered off the ground in visible waves. Eleanor dressed in her best remaining dress, a deep blue cotton that had been nice once and was at least clean and mended, and helped her mother into a dove-gray silk that had somehow survived the journey west. Catherine was having a good day, her breathing easier, her color better than it had been in weeks, and Eleanor sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for small mercies. Caleb had hitched the wagon and cleaned himself up properly, his hair trimmed, his jaw freshly shaved, wearing a white shirt that looked almost formal against his sun-darkened skin. When Eleanor emerged from the house, he went very still, his eyes widening slightly. "You look beautiful," he said, the words coming out rougher than usual. Then he seemed to catch himself, color rising above his collar. "Both of you. You both look very nice." Eleanor felt heat rise to her own cheeks, unused to compliments, unused to being looked at the way Caleb was looking at her now, with something that went beyond simple appreciation into something warmer, more dangerous. The ride to the Garrett Ranch took nearly an hour, and with each passing mile, Eleanor felt her anxiety increase. She'd faced difficult social situations before, had learned to navigate Boston society with its rigid rules and subtle cruelties. But this felt different, more personal somehow. These people weren't strangers making judgments from a comfortable distance. These were Caleb's neighbors, his community, and their opinions would shape how she and her mother were treated for however long they stayed. The Garrett place came into view gradually, a sprawling ranch house with a wide porch, corrals and outbuildings scattered across cleared land, and what looked like half the county gathered in the yard. Eleanor counted at least 30 people, maybe more, clustered in groups that shifted and reformed like water finding its level. The sound of voices and laughter carried across the distance, along with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop near the other vehicles, and immediately heads began to turn. Conversations faltered mid-sentence as people registered their arrival, and Eleanor felt the weight of those stares like a physical pressure against her skin. "Steady," Caleb murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. "We'll get through this." He climbed down first, then helped Catherine descend with careful hands. Eleanor took his offered hand and stepped down, acutely aware that every person there was watching, judging, forming opinions they'd share later in whispers and knowing looks. "Caleb!" A woman's voice called out, warm and genuine. A small Chinese woman in her 40s hurried toward them, her smile lighting up her round face. "I'm so glad you came, and you must be Eleanor and Mrs. Wright. Welcome, welcome, I'm Sarah Chen." The kindness in her voice was like cool water after a long thirst. Eleanor found herself smiling back, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Chen. Caleb speaks very highly of you." "Does he?" Sarah's eyes danced with amusement as she glanced at Caleb. "How surprising. He's not usually one for speaking highly of anyone." She linked her arm through Catherine's with easy familiarity. "Mrs. Wright, you must be exhausted from the journey. Come sit in the shade with me and the other ladies. We have lemonade, and you can ignore all the men making fools of themselves trying to show off for each other." Catherine allowed herself to be led away, and Eleanor moved to follow, but Caleb's hand on her elbow stopped her. "The men will want to meet you first," he said quietly. "It's a show of respect. Me introducing my intended to them before the women get their turn at interrogation." Intended. The word hung in the air between them, neither quite true nor quite false. They hadn't discussed marriage again since that first day, hadn't made any formal arrangement or set any dates. But the word gave them legitimacy, gave this whole situation a framework that people could understand and accept. Eleanor straightened her spine and lifted her chin. "All right then. Introduce me." The next hour was a blur of names and faces, handshakes, and careful pleasantries. The men were easier than Eleanor expected. Most seemed genuinely pleased that Caleb had found someone, though she caught more than a few speculative glances and heard the questions they were too polite to ask aloud. Where exactly had she come from? What were her people? How had she ended up in New Mexico with a sick mother and no husband? Tom Garrett was the exception, his handshake lasting a beat too long, his smile sharp with something that might have been mockery. "Miss Wright," he drawled. "So you're the one who's got Monroe here all twisted up. Have to say you're braver than most, taking on a man and his ranch without knowing what you're getting into." "I'd say I know exactly what I'm getting into, Mr. Garrett," Eleanor replied evenly. "Caleb's been very forthcoming about the realities of ranch life." "Has he now?" Tom's grin widened. "Did he mention the winter we had 2 years back? Snowed so hard we lost half the cattle in the territory. Or the drought the year before that? This land can break you if you're not careful, Miss Wright. Break you right in half." "Tom." Caleb's voice was quiet, but carried an edge Eleanor had never heard before. "Eleanor doesn't need your warnings. She's tougher than you're giving her credit for. If you say so. Tom raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation, Monroe, no need to get touchy. But Caleb's jaw was tight as they moved away, and Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him. Don't let him get to you, she said softly. Men like that, they poke at anything that looks vulnerable. It's how they feel powerful. You're not vulnerable, Caleb said. No, Eleanor agreed, but he thinks I am. That's enough for him. The women's gathering was both better and worse. Sarah Chen had positioned Catherine in a comfortable chair and surrounded her with the kinder souls, older women who remembered what it was like to be new and uncertain, younger women who were simply curious rather than judgmental. But Mrs. Kimball held court on the opposite side of the porch, her expression pinched with disapproval, and Eleanor could feel the woman's eyes tracking her every movement. Miss Wright. The summons came eventually, inevitable as sunset. A word, if you please. Eleanor excused herself from Sarah's group and crossed to where Mrs. Kimball sat enthroned in a wicker chair, 3 other women clustered around her like ladies in waiting. She recognized one of them from the stage stop, Grace Kimball, presumably, the daughter Caleb had mentioned. The younger woman was indeed pretty, with fair hair and delicate features, and her eyes when they met Eleanor's held a complicated mix of relief and resentment. Mrs. Kimball, Eleanor said, keeping her voice neutral, thank you for including us today. I didn't include you, dear. This is Tom and Martha's gathering, not mine. Mrs. Kimball's smile didn't reach her eyes. But since you're here, I thought we should speak plainly. There are questions, you understand, about your situation. What questions might those be? Well, Mrs. Kimball settled more deeply into her chair, clearly relishing this moment. You arrive with no notice, bringing your ailing mother when the agreement was for you alone. You move into Mr. Monroe's house unchaperoned. My mother is there, Eleanor interrupted. That's hardly unchaperoned. Your sick mother, who spends most of her time abed, from what I hear. That's not proper supervision, Miss Wright, and you know it. People are talking, wondering what's really happening out at the Monroe Ranch, wondering if Mr. Monroe is being taken advantage of by a clever woman with nowhere else to go. Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she kept her voice level. Mrs. Kimball, I understand your concern for propriety, but my relationship with Caleb, with Mr. Monroe, is exactly what it appears to be. We corresponded, we came to an understanding, and we're taking the time to get to know each other properly before making any final decisions. As for my mother, she's ill, yes, but she's also a perfectly adequate chaperone when needed. When needed, Mrs. Kimball repeated, her voice dripping skepticism. And how often is she needed, I wonder? How many evenings have you and Mr. Monroe spent alone together without proper supervision? Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but a voice cut across the tension before she could speak. Mother, stop it. Grace Kimball had stood, her hands clenched at her sides, spots of color burning high on her cheeks. This is cruel and unnecessary, and you know it. Mrs. Kimball's eyes widened. Grace? No. Grace's voice shook, but held firm. Miss Wright has done nothing wrong. She answered an advertisement, just like dozens of other women do every year. She came west to build a new life, and the fact that she brought her sick mother with her speaks to her character, not against it. You're just upset because Caleb chose her instead of me, and we both know I never wanted him anyway. The silence that fell was absolute. Every woman on the porch had frozen, and Eleanor could see men turning toward them from across the yard, sensing drama. Mrs. Kimball rose slowly, her face mottled with rage and embarrassment. We are leaving, she said to Grace, immediately. Go ahead, Grace crossed her arms. I'll find my own way home. Mother and daughter locked eyes for a long, tense moment. Then Mrs. Kimball swept past, her skirt snapping with the force of her movement, and stalked toward the wagons. After a moment's hesitation, 2 of her companions followed. Grace let out a shaky breath and sank back into her chair. Well, she said to no one in particular. That went better than expected. Eleanor stared at her, this stranger who'd just defended her at considerable personal cost. Miss Kimball, Grace, I don't know what to say. Thank you seems inadequate. Thank you is fine. Grace's smile was wry. And please, call me Grace. I have a feeling we're going to be friends, you and I. If only because we've both escaped my mother's matchmaking attempts. Laughter rippled through the gathered women, breaking the tension. Sarah Chen appeared at Eleanor's elbow, pressing a glass of lemonade into her hand. "Drink," she ordered. "You look like you need it." Eleanor drank, the tart sweetness grounding her, bringing her back to herself. Around her, conversations resumed, the crisis passed, and she realized with surprise that several women were now looking at her with something approaching approval. She'd been tested and hadn't backed down. Grace's defense had helped, but Eleanor's own composure had mattered too. The rest of the afternoon passed more easily. Catherine dozed in her chair while Eleanor talked with Sarah about gardening, with Grace about books, with Martha Garrett about the challenges of cooking in high altitude. She learned that Sarah's husband ran the general store in town, that Grace was teaching herself photography, that Martha had 7 children and somehow maintained her sanity. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Caleb found her standing apart from the crowd, watching the light paint the landscape in shades of amber and rose. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Not quite yet." Eleanor turned to face him. "Caleb, what Grace said earlier about you choosing me over her, was that true? Did Mrs. Kimball really try to match you?" "For 2 years," Caleb confirmed. "Grace is a good person, but we're wrong for each other. I told Mrs. Kimball that more than once, but she wouldn't listen. She thought I just needed time to see Grace's virtues." He paused. "What she never understood was that I already saw them. Grace is smart and funny and talented, but when I imagined spending my life with her, all I felt was nothing," Eleanor finished. "Nothing," he agreed. "Whereas with you—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was venturing into dangerous territory. "With you, I feel something. I don't know what it is yet, or where it's going, but it's not nothing." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. They stood close enough that she could see the darker flecks in his gray eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and sun-warmed cotton. "I feel it too," she said quietly. "This something, whatever it is." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. Saw the intention form in his eyes, saw him lean almost imperceptibly closer. But then Catherine's voice called from the porch. "Eleanor, I think I'm ready to go home now, dear," and the moment broke like a soap bubble. "We should get your mother," Caleb said, stepping back, and Eleanor couldn't tell if the regret in his voice matched the regret in her chest. They said their goodbyes, collected Catherine, and began the journey home as twilight settled over the land. Catherine dozed against Eleanor's shoulder while Caleb drove, and Eleanor let her mind drift, processing everything that had happened. The confrontation with Mrs. Kimball, Grace's unexpected defense, the approval she'd seen in other women's eyes by the end of the afternoon. But most of all, she thought about that almost kiss, about the something Caleb had admitted to feeling, about the way her own heart had responded to his nearness. 6 weeks ago, she'd been desperate and alone in Santa Fe. 4 weeks ago, she'd been terrified on a stagecoach heading toward an uncertain future. Now she was riding through the New Mexico dusk beside a man who made her feel things she'd thought she'd never feel, heading back to a place that was starting to feel like home. "Thank you," she said into the gathering dark. Caleb glanced at her. "For what?" "For defending me to Tom Garrett. For standing with me at the gathering. For—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For making me feel like I belong here." "You do belong here," Caleb said simply. "You just needed time to see it." When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Catherine inside while Eleanor unhitched the wagon, another skill she'd learned in the past weeks. She worked slowly, giving Caleb time to settle her mother, giving herself time to settle the tumult of emotions churning through her chest. By the time she entered the house, Catherine had already retired to the bedroom, and Caleb was at the stove making tea. He handed her a cup without speaking, and they stood together by the window watching the last light fade from the sky. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. "Anything." "That night with Rosie's foal, you said you were glad we were here. Did you mean it? Or were you just being kind?" Caleb was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I meant it. This house was dying before you came, Eleanor. I was dying, though I didn't want to admit it. Going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. You changed that. You and your mother both. You brought, he paused, struggling. You brought life back into these walls, laughter and conversation, and the sound of someone singing while they work. I didn't know how much I'd been missing those things until I had them again. We're still not married, Eleanor pointed out. We're in this strange in-between place where we're more than friends, but not quite what? Caleb set down his cup and turned to face her fully. Say it, Eleanor. Not quite courting, she whispered. Not quite promised to each other. Not quite anything that has a name. Then let's give it one. Caleb reached for her hand, and Eleanor let him take it, let him thread his rough fingers through her own. Eleanor Wright, I would like to court you, properly. With your mother's blessing and the town's knowledge and all the respect you deserve, I'd like to take you riding and talk with you over dinner, and see if this something between us grows into the kind of love that lasts. Will you let me do that? Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and sudden. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll let you court me, Caleb Monroe. I'd like nothing more. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that she was already half in love with this quiet, steady man who'd seen her at her most desperate and chosen kindness anyway. Good, Caleb said softly. That's good. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, and Eleanor felt that small gesture echo through her entire body like a bell being struck. Then he released her and stepped back, propriety reasserting itself, but his eyes held a promise of more to come. That night, lying beside her mother in the darkness, Eleanor replayed the evening over and over. The gathering, the confrontation, Grace's defense, Caleb's request. It felt like a turning point, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold into new territory. You're thinking very loudly, dear, Catherine murmured from beside her. Sorry, Mama. I didn't mean to wake you. I wasn't asleep. Catherine shifted, and Eleanor heard the smile in her voice. He asked to court you properly, didn't he? How did you know? Because I saw the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching, and I saw the way you looked back. Catherine reached for Eleanor's hand in the darkness. Do you love him? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I don't know yet. I think I could, though. I think maybe I'm already starting to. Is that foolish, after such a short time? Love has its own timeline, Catherine said. Sometimes it takes years to grow, sometimes it strikes like lightning, and sometimes it's both at once. A slow burning that's been building without you noticing until suddenly it's there, warm and bright, and impossible to ignore. Is that how it was with you and Papa? Yes. Catherine's voice softened with memory. We were friends first, your father and I. For nearly 2 years we were just friends. And then one day I looked at him and realized I couldn't imagine my life without him in it. That's when I knew. Eleanor thought about Caleb, about the way her day felt incomplete if she didn't see him, about how natural it had become to work beside him, to sit with him in comfortable silence, to share the small moments that made up a life. I can't imagine my life without him now, she admitted. Is that love? Or is that just gratitude and circumstance? Only you can answer that, dear. But I will say this, gratitude doesn't make your heart race when he walks into a room. Circumstance doesn't make you smile at the sound of his voice. What you're feeling may have started in desperation, but it's grown into something real. I can see it. He can see it. The only person who seems uncertain is you. I'm afraid, Eleanor whispered. What if I'm wrong? What if this is just... Eleanor. Catherine's hand tightened on hers. I don't have years left to give you advice. Months, maybe, if we're very lucky. So let me say this while I can. That man out there in the barn, sleeping on horse blankets because he gave you his bed. He's good. He's kind. He's honest. Those things are worth more than passion or poetry or any of the romantic notions young women are taught to value. Build your life on that foundation, and the rest will follow. Eleanor felt tears slip down her temples into her hair. I wish you could stay to see it, whatever we become. So do I, my love. So do I. Catherine's breathing had turned labored with the effort of so much talking. But whether I'm here or not, you'll be all right. You're stronger than you know. And you've found a good man in a good place. That's more than most people get in this life. They lay in silence then, mother and daughter, hands joined in the darkness, both thinking about time and how little of it they had left together. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, and somewhere in the barn a horse whinnied softly in response. The New Mexico night held them all, the dying woman and her daughter, the man who'd offered them sanctuary, the land that was slowly becoming home, in its vast, indifferent embrace. And Eleanor, staring up at shadows on the ceiling, felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, not quite certainty, but something close, something that felt like the beginning of forever. September arrived with cooler mornings and the first whisper of autumn in the air. The cottonwoods along the creek began to turn, their leaves shifting from green to gold, and the light took on a different quality, sharper, cleaner, as though the dust of summer had finally settled. Eleanor noticed these changes now in ways she never would have when she first arrived, her awareness of the land's rhythms growing deeper with each passing day. The courting, as Caleb had formally requested, took shape in small, deliberate ways. He brought her wildflowers he'd found while checking fence lines, their stems wrapped carefully in a damp cloth to keep them fresh. She mended his shirts with finer stitches than strictly necessary, adding small embroidered details at the cuffs that made him duck his head with pleased embarrassment. They took longer rides together now, ranging farther from the ranch, and Caleb showed her the places he loved. A high meadow where elk grazed at dawn, a spring-fed pool hidden in a box canyon, an overlook where you could see 3 mountain ranges stretching toward distant horizons. But beneath the sweetness of their growing attachment, Catherine's decline had become impossible to ignore. The good days grew fewer, the bad days worse. Some mornings she couldn't rise from bed without Eleanor's help, and the cough that had been occasional in August became constant in September, rattling in her chest like stones in a jar. Eleanor tried to hide her fear, tried to maintain the careful balance between hope and preparation, but Caleb saw through her pretense. He always saw through it. "How much laudanum is left?" he asked one evening as they stood together in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer squash. Eleanor's hands stilled on the vine she'd been examining. "Maybe 2 weeks' worth, if I'm careful with the doses." "And after that?" "I don't know." She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, not meeting his eyes. "The medicine is expensive, and we don't have... I've been trying to figure out how to ask Sarah if she knows where I might find work in town, something I could do a few days a week to earn enough for..." "Eleanor." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "Stop." "Stop what?" "Stop trying to carry this alone." He moved closer, his hands finding her shoulders, turning her to face him. "We're courting, remember? That means your burdens are mine, too. If your mother needs medicine, we'll get her medicine." "I can't ask you to..." "You're not asking, I'm offering." His gray eyes were steady on hers. "How much does a bottle cost?" $5, Eleanor whispered. "Sometimes 6, depending on the supplier." She watched him do the math in his head, saw him calculate what that meant against the ranch's income, against all the other necessities that demanded money. $5 was half what he'd get for selling a steer, a quarter of what a good horse brought. It wasn't an impossible sum, but it wasn't negligible either. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," he said. "Talk to the doctor, see about getting a steady supply." "Caleb, you can't keep paying for..." "Can't I?" He pulled her closer, and Eleanor felt the solid warmth of him, the steadiness she'd come to depend on. "Eleanor, I knew what I was taking on when I brought you both home. I'm not a fool. I understood your mother was dying, understood it would cost money and time, and..." His voice roughened. "And that it would hurt. I chose it anyway. I'm still choosing it." Eleanor buried her face against his chest, feeling the tears come hot and fast. She'd been holding them back for weeks, maintaining her composure through Catherine's worst days. Through the moments when the cough was so bad, Eleanor feared each breath might be the last. But here, in Caleb's arms, in the garden they'd tended together, she finally let herself break. "I'm so afraid," she whispered against his shirt. "Every morning I wake up terrified that she won't wake up with me. Every time she coughs, I think this is it. This is when I lose her. And I'm not ready, Caleb. I'll never be ready." "I know." He held her tighter, one hand stroking her hair with infinite tenderness. "But you're not facing it alone anymore, you hear me? Whatever comes, we face it together." They stood like that until Eleanor's tears subsided, until her breathing steadied and she could lift her head without shame. Caleb's shirt was damp where her face had pressed against it, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He just looked at her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I love you," she said, the words emerging before she'd consciously decided to speak them. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you, Caleb Monroe." His entire face transformed, wonder and joy chasing across his features like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Eleanor," he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, more certain, tasting of coffee and promise, and all the things they hadn't yet said aloud. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you too," he said. "Have for weeks now, probably. I just didn't want to rush you, didn't want you to feel obligated, or—" "I don't feel obligated," Eleanor interrupted. "I feel grateful and terrified and more alive than I've been in years. I feel like I've come home, Caleb, like all the running and fear and desperation led me exactly where I was meant to be." He kissed her again, slower this time, reverent, and Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble. This was real. This was right. Whatever time she had with her mother, however much it hurt when the end came, she would face it with this man beside her. She wouldn't be alone. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they entered, Catherine looked up from her mending with knowing eyes. "Well," she said, her voice wheezy but amused, "it's about time you two figured it out." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mama? Don't mama me, dear. I've been watching you dance around each other for weeks. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you in the barn together." Catherine set down her sewing and extended a hand to Caleb. "Come here, young man." Caleb crossed to her, and Catherine took his hand in both of hers. Her grip was weak, her fingers thin as bird bones, but her gaze was fierce. "You'll take care of her," she said. It wasn't a question. "I will," Caleb promised. "You have my word. And you'll be patient with her. She's stubborn and proud, and sometimes she tries to carry more than she should, but that's only because she's been hurt and she's learned to protect herself." "I know," Caleb said gently. "I'll be patient." "Good." Catherine released his hand and sat back, looking between them both. "Then you have my blessing. Whatever you decide to do, whenever you decide to do it, you have my blessing." Eleanor crossed to her mother, kneeling beside the chair, taking those fragile hands in her own. "Mama, we haven't talked about—" "You will," Catherine said simply. "And when you do, I want you to know that I'm happy for you, that I can leave this world knowing you're settled and safe and loved. That's all any mother wants for her child." The words hung in the air, beautiful and terrible, an acknowledgement of what they'd all been avoiding. Catherine was saying goodbye. Not today, not this week, but soon. The unspoken reality they'd been dancing around was suddenly impossible to ignore. That night, Eleanor sat with her mother long after Caleb had gone to the barn, talking in quiet voices about everything and nothing. Catherine told stories from Eleanor's childhood, ones Eleanor had heard dozens of times but needed to hear again, needed to commit to memory against the day when there would be no one left to tell them. She talked about Eleanor's father, about their courtship and marriage, about the life they'd built together. "He would have liked Caleb," Catherine said as the lamp burned low. "Your father always said the best men are the ones who don't need to prove anything, who just do what needs doing without complaint or expectation of praise. That's Caleb. That's the kind of man you want beside you when life gets hard." "Life has been hard," Eleanor said, "for so long now." "Yes, but it's getting better. Can you feel it?" Catherine's eyes were bright despite her exhaustion. "You're building something good here, Eleanor, something that will last long after I'm gone. Hold on to that. When the grief comes, and it will come, hold on to the good you're building and let it carry you through." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Catherine would be there to see it all, but she couldn't form the words around the lump in her throat. Instead, she just held her mother's hand and nodded, and Catherine seemed to understand everything she couldn't say. Caleb rode to town the next morning as promised, and returned with not just one bottle of laudanum but 3, plus a package of other medicines the doctor had recommended. He also brought fabric, soft flannel in a pale blue that matched Eleanor's eyes. And when she started to protest the expense, he just shook his head. "Wedding dress," he said simply. "If you'll have me, Eleanor Wright. If you'll marry me properly and let me make this arrangement permanent." Eleanor's breath caught. They'd been courting for barely a month, had known each other in person for only 10 weeks. By any conventional standard, it was too fast, too reckless. But nothing about their situation had ever been conventional, and Eleanor found she didn't care about standards or propriety or what anyone else might think. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, Caleb Monroe." They were wed 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the ranch with Reverend Phillips officiating and a small gathering of neighbors as witnesses. Sarah Chen stood up with Eleanor, Grace Kimball played the guitar, and even Mrs. Kimball attended, her disapproval muted by her daughter's pointed looks. Catherine sat in a chair of honor, wrapped in blankets despite the mild October day, her eyes bright with joy and fever both. Eleanor wore a dress she'd sewn herself from Caleb's blue flannel, with lace trim that Sarah had contributed, and pearl buttons that had been Catherine's own mother's. It wasn't grand, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and when Caleb saw her walking toward him across the ranch yard, his expression made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. "I, Caleb John Monroe, take you, Eleanor Marie Wright, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Eleanor repeated the vows with equal certainty, and when Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb's kiss was gentle and reverent and full of promise. The small crowd cheered, and Eleanor caught her mother's eye across the gathering, saw the tears streaming down Catherine's face, saw the smile that made everything worth it. They celebrated with a simple meal, roasted chicken and vegetables from the garden, bread Sarah had baked, a cake Grace had somehow managed despite the altitude. Tom Garrett gave a speech that was only slightly inappropriate, and Sarah made everyone laugh with stories about the early days of her own marriage. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, people began to drift away, calling out congratulations and well wishes. Finally, it was just the three of them, Caleb and Eleanor and Catherine. They sat together on the porch, watching the last light fade from the mountains, and Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known since before her father died. This was family. This was home. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing how to name it. "I'm going to retire early," Catherine said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let you two have your wedding night." Eleanor helped her mother to bed, tucking the quilts around her with tender care. Catherine's breathing was labored, her skin hot to the touch, and Eleanor felt fear spike through her contentment. The medicine was helping, but it couldn't cure anything. It could only buy time, and time was running out. "Mama," she started. "I'm happy, Eleanor," Catherine interrupted. "Truly, deeply happy. I got to see you married to a good man. I got to stand up at your wedding. That's more than I dared hope for when we left Santa Fe." She reached up and cupped Eleanor's face in her palm, the touch feather light. "Go to your husband, my darling girl. Don't waste this night worrying about me. I'll still be here in the morning." Eleanor kissed her mother's forehead and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb was waiting in the main room, still in his wedding clothes, his eyes dark with want and tenderness, both. "She all right?" he asked. "As all right as she can be." Eleanor crossed to him, her heart hammering. This was their wedding night. In just a few moments, everything would change between them. The final barrier would fall. She was nervous, yes, but not afraid. Never afraid. Not with Caleb. He took her hand and led her to the bedroom, his bedroom, their bedroom now, where he'd somehow found time to prepare. Fresh sheets on the bed, wildflowers in a jar on the dresser, the lamp turned low. It was simple and thoughtful, and so perfectly Caleb that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "I've never," she started, then stopped, heat flooding her face. "I know." Caleb's voice was gentle. "Neither have I. We'll figure it out together." And they did, with patience and tenderness and occasional awkward laughter when things didn't quite work as expected. But beneath the fumbling and uncertainty was something profound, a joining not just of bodies but of lives, of futures, of everything they were and hoped to become. When it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eleanor felt transformed. She was someone's wife now. She belonged to him and he to her, bound by law and love and the promises they'd made. "I love you," Caleb murmured against her hair. "My wife." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back. "My husband." They slept wrapped in each other's arms, and Eleanor dreamed of the life stretching out before them, children to fill the loft, years of shared work and shared joy, growing old together on this land they both loved. Beautiful dreams, full of hope and possibility. She woke to screaming. For a disoriented moment, Eleanor thought the sound was part of her dream, but then Caleb was sitting up beside her, his body tense, and the scream came again, ragged and desperate and unmistakably Catherine's. Eleanor was out of bed and running before fully conscious thought engaged, Caleb right behind her. She burst into her mother's room to find Catherine writhing in the bed, her face contorted with pain, her hands clawing at her chest. "Mama!" Eleanor fell to her knees beside the bed, trying to catch those flailing hands. "Mama, what is it? What's wrong?" "Can't breathe," Catherine gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Eleanor, can't—" "The laudanum," Caleb said, already moving toward the dresser where they kept the medicines. "Double dose, now." Eleanor's hands shook as she measured out the medicine, spilling half of it in her haste. Caleb took the bottle from her gently, his own hand steady, and prepared the dose while Eleanor held her mother, murmuring reassurances she didn't believe. Getting Catherine to swallow the medicine took precious minutes, but finally it was done, and they could only wait for it to take effect. Eleanor held her mother's hand, feeling the pulse flutter weak and erratic beneath her fingers, watching the terrible struggle for each breath. "I'm here, Mama," she whispered. "I'm right here. You're not alone." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the laudanum began to work. Catherine's breathing eased slightly, the desperate panic fading from her eyes. But the damage was done. Something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed, and they all knew it. "I'm sorry," Catherine whispered when she could speak again. "Your wedding night, I ruined—" "Hush," Eleanor said fiercely. "You didn't ruin anything. Don't you dare apologize." But as the long night wore on, as Eleanor sat vigil beside her mother's bed while Caleb dozed in the chair by the door, she felt the truth settle into her bones. This was the beginning of the end. Not the slow, manageable decline they'd been living with, but the final descent. Days now, maybe. Weeks, if they were very lucky. But not months. Never months. Dawn came gray and cold, and Catherine was still breathing, but each breath sounded like it cost everything she had. Eleanor helped her sit up to take medicine, helped her sip water, helped her with the intimate necessities of a body that was failing. Through it all, Catherine maintained her dignity, her fierce pride refusing to bow completely, even as her strength ebbed away. Caleb brought food that Eleanor couldn't eat, coffee that went cold in her hands. He sat with Catherine when Eleanor needed to wash, to change clothes, to step outside and breathe air that didn't smell of sickness. He read aloud from the Bible when Catherine requested it, his rough voice stumbling over the formal language but persisting because she asked. 3 days passed like this, then 4. On the 5th day, Catherine woke clearer than she'd been since the wedding, her eyes bright and focused. Eleanor recognized it immediately, the final rally, the last surge of energy before the end. She'd seen it in her father, had heard the doctor in Santa Fe describe it, the body's final gift to the dying, a chance to say goodbye. "Eleanor," Catherine said, her voice weak but audible. "Bring Caleb. I want to talk to you both." Eleanor fetched him from the barn where he'd been giving them privacy, and they sat together on either side of Catherine's bed, each holding one of her hands. "I need you to promise me something," Catherine said, looking between them. "Both of you." "Anything, Mama." "When I'm gone, and I will be soon, we all know it. I need you to live, Eleanor. Really live. Don't let grief consume you. Don't spend years mourning me when you should be building your life with this good man." She turned to Caleb. "And you. Take care of her, but don't coddle her. She's strong, stronger than she knows. Let her be strong. Let her grow into the woman she's meant to be." "I will," Caleb promised, his voice thick with emotion. "And children," Catherine continued. "Have children. Fill this house with laughter and noise and all the beautiful chaos of family. That's what I want. That's what will make my leaving bearable, knowing that I'm not the end of the line, that there will be more rights, more love, more life." "We will, Mama," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." "Good." Catherine's eyes were closing, her brief energy already fading. "So good. My beautiful girl. My brave, strong, beautiful girl. I'm so proud of you." She slept then, and didn't wake again. For 2 more days she lingered, her breathing growing shallower, her periods of consciousness growing briefer. Eleanor sat with her constantly, holding her hand, telling her stories about the ranch and the neighbors and the life she was building. She told her mother about the garden plans for next spring, about the foal Rosie had birthed, about Grace Kimball's latest photography experiments. She talked until her voice was hoarse, until there was nothing left to say, until the silence between them felt less like absence and more like peace. Catherine Wright died just before dawn on October 23, 1879, with Eleanor holding one hand and Caleb holding the other. She simply stopped breathing, her chest going still mid-breath, her face relaxing into an expression of such profound peace that Eleanor felt grateful even through her grief. "She's gone," Eleanor whispered, the words tearing out of her like something physical. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor wept against his chest the way she'd wept in the garden weeks ago, but harder now, deeper, the grief a living thing inside her clawing to get out. She cried until she had nothing left, until the tears stopped coming and she was just empty, hollowed out, a shell of herself. They buried Catherine the next day in a spot overlooking the creek, beneath a cottonwood that had turned brilliant gold. Reverend Phillips said words about dust and ashes and resurrection. Sarah Chen sang a hymn in her clear soprano. Grace read a poem about mothers and daughters, and Eleanor stood beside Caleb, his arm around her waist, and felt the terrible finality of it all. Her mother was gone. The woman who'd raised her, protected her, loved her through everything, gone, just gone. That night, back at the ranch that felt too empty without Catherine's presence, Eleanor moved through the rooms like a ghost. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but exist in the howling void her mother's death had left behind. Caleb didn't try to fix it, didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He just stayed close, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her grief. When she finally collapsed into bed, he held her while she cried herself into exhausted sleep, and when she woke in the gray hours before dawn, he was still there, still holding her, keeping the darkness at bay. "I don't know how to do this," Eleanor whispered into the silence. "How to live without her." "One day at a time," Caleb said quietly. "Some days 1 hour at a time, some days 1 breath at a time. But you'll do it, Eleanor. You'll survive this because you're strong enough to survive anything. Your mother knew that, I know it. Someday you'll know it too." Eleanor closed her eyes and let his words wash over her. Let herself believe that maybe, eventually, the grief would become bearable. That the hole her mother's death had torn in her heart would heal even if it never fully closed. Outside, the New Mexico sky was beginning to lighten, painting the mountains in shades of lavender and rose. A new day was coming, whether Eleanor was ready for it or not. And somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to get up, to keep moving, to live the life they'd both fought so hard for her to have. So she would. Not today, maybe, and not tomorrow, but soon, for her mother's memory, for Caleb, for herself. She would live. The grief came in waves, sometimes predictable and sometimes ambushing Eleanor when she least expected it. She would be kneading bread and suddenly remember her mother's hands doing the same, and the tears would come so fast she'd have to stop, flour dusting her wet cheeks. Or she'd hear a bird singing Catherine's favorite hymn and find herself unable to breathe. The smallest things became unbearable. A particular slant of afternoon light, the scent of lavender, the sound of wind through the cottonwoods. Caleb weathered it all with quiet patience. He held her when she needed holding, gave her space when she needed solitude, and somehow knew which was which without being told. He took over the cooking during those first terrible weeks, producing simple meals that Eleanor forced herself to eat because not eating would worry him. He kept the ranch running, kept the rhythm of their days steady, even when Eleanor felt like she was drowning in formless grief. "Talk to me," he said one evening in late November as they sat before the fire. "Tell me what you're feeling." Eleanor stared into the flames, trying to find words for the chaos inside her. "I feel guilty," she said finally, "that I'm here, alive, and building a future, while she's—" Her voice broke. "While she's in the ground." "Your mother didn't die so you could stop living, Eleanor. She died knowing you were safe and loved and exactly where you were meant to be. There's no guilt in that, only gratitude." "I know that in my head," Eleanor whispered, "but my heart doesn't believe it yet." "It will," Caleb said. "Give it time." Time moved strangely in those months. Days blurred together, marked only by the changing seasons. The first snow in December, the bitter cold of January, the slow warming of February. Eleanor moved through them all mechanically at first, doing what needed doing without really feeling anything. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with the garden. In early March, when the worst of winter had passed, Eleanor found herself standing at the window, staring at the patch of earth that had lain dormant all winter. She thought about the seeds Sarah had given her, about the plans she'd made before Catherine died. Her mother had loved gardens, had taught Eleanor everything she knew about coaxing life from soil. "I want to plant something," she said to Caleb that evening, "for Mama. Something beautiful that will bloom every year." "What did you have in mind?" "Roses, maybe, pink ones. She loved pink roses." Eleanor paused, surprised to find herself smiling at the memory. "When I was little, she had a bush in our garden in Boston. Every summer it would bloom, and she'd cut fresh flowers for the kitchen table every week. The whole house would smell of them." "Then we'll plant roses," Caleb said, "as many as you want." They ordered the plants from a catalog, 3 hardy varieties that the supplier promised would survive New Mexico's climate. When they arrived in April, Caleb helped Eleanor dig holes near Catherine's grave, amending the soil with compost, setting each plant with care. Eleanor's hands remembered the work, the feel of earth beneath her fingernails, the satisfaction of creating something that would outlast her. "She would have liked this," Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels and surveying their work. "She always said a person's legacy isn't in grand monuments, but in the small beauties they leave behind." "She left you," Caleb said quietly. "That's the most beautiful legacy of all." The roses took root and began to grow, sending up new shoots that promised future blooms. And with them, something in Eleanor began to heal. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that she could feel it. The slow knitting together of torn places, the cautious return of hope. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with new energy. She took over more of the cooking, experimenting with recipes Sarah shared and inventing her own. She expanded the garden, planting vegetables and herbs in neat rows that she tended with the same devotion she'd once given to grieving. She learned to help Caleb with the cattle, to recognize when an animal was ailing, to assist during calving season. And slowly, hesitantly, she began to feel like herself again. Not the same self she'd been before Catherine died. That person was gone, changed irrevocably by loss. But someone new, someone stronger, someone who carried her grief but wasn't consumed by it. "You're coming back to me," Caleb said one evening in May as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I can see it in your eyes." Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who'd stood beside her through the darkest months of her life without flinching. "I never really left," she said. "I was just lost for a while, but you kept the light on so I could find my way home." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Eleanor felt desire stir for the first time since Catherine's death. They'd shared a bed all winter, had held each other through long nights, but there had been nothing physical beyond comfort. Caleb had never pushed, never demanded, had simply waited for her to come back to herself in her own time. "I'm ready," she whispered against his mouth, "to really be your wife again, if you'll have me." "I'll always have you," Caleb said, and led her inside. That night they came together with a tenderness that made Eleanor weep, but these were healing tears, cleansing tears. And afterward, lying in Caleb's arms with moonlight spilling through the window, Eleanor felt something slot back into place. She was whole again, different, forever marked by loss, but whole nonetheless. Summer arrived with its familiar heat and long days. Grace Kimball became a regular visitor, riding out to the ranch once a week to share books and gossip and friendship. Sarah Chen taught Eleanor to make her grandmother's dumplings, and Eleanor taught Sarah to make her mother's biscuits. The ranch prospered, the cattle herd growing, 2 more foals born healthy and strong. And then, in late July, Eleanor realized she'd missed her monthly courses. Twice. She didn't say anything at first, afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it. But when August arrived and there was still no sign, when her breasts became tender and nausea struck her every morning, she couldn't deny it any longer. She was carrying Caleb's child. Eleanor sat with the knowledge for 3 days before telling him, needing time to adjust to the enormity of it. She was going to be a mother. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. All her life she'd imagined having children someday, but it had always been abstract, theoretical. Now it was real, growing inside her, a tiny spark of life that would change everything. She chose to tell him on a Sunday morning in mid-August, exactly 1 year from the day she'd stepped off the stagecoach and into his life. They were sitting on the porch drinking coffee, and Eleanor set down her cup with hands that shook slightly. "Caleb," she said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, instantly alert to the tremor in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Eleanor took a breath, let it out slowly. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the most brilliant smile Eleanor had ever seen, joy radiating from him like light. "A baby," he breathed. "Eleanor, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. I've missed 2 courses, and I'm sick every morning, and I feel different somehow. The same way Mama said she felt when she was carrying me." Eleanor's voice caught on the word Mama, but it didn't hurt quite as much as it once had. "I think she'd be happy that she got her wish about us filling this house with children." "She'd be ecstatic," Caleb said, pulling Eleanor into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We're going to have a baby. I'm going to be a father." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." Caleb pulled back just far enough to kiss her, deep and thorough. "You've given me everything, Eleanor. A home that feels like home, a purpose beyond just surviving, and now this. How could I be anything but happy?" They told Sarah first, and then Grace, and then gradually the rest of the community. By September, everyone knew, and Eleanor found herself the recipient of endless advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and offers of help. Mrs. Kimball even thought enough to contribute a beautifully embroidered christening gown that had been in her family for generations. "For when the time comes," she said stiffly, pressing the garment into Eleanor's hands, "every child deserves something fine for their baptism." Eleanor thanked her with genuine warmth, understanding that this was Mrs. Kimball's way of apologizing for her earlier harshness. The older woman would never say the words directly, but the gesture spoke volumes. As autumn arrived again, Eleanor's body began to change in visible ways. Her waist thickened, her breasts grew fuller, and by October a definite roundness had appeared in her belly. Caleb was fascinated by every change, his hand constantly finding her stomach, his face lighting up the first time he felt the baby move. "There," Eleanor said, pressing his palm more firmly against the spot where tiny feet or fists were drumming. "Feel that?" "I feel it." Wonder filled Caleb's voice. "That's our baby in there, our child. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl?" "I don't care," Caleb said honestly. "As long as they're healthy and you both come through it safely. That's all I want." Winter came mild that year, with less snow than usual, and temperatures that rarely dropped below freezing. Eleanor grew larger, moving more slowly, needing help with tasks that had once been simple. Caleb doted on her shamelessly, insisting she rest when she wanted to work, bringing her endless cups of tea, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings. "You're going to spoil me," Eleanor protested one night in January as he massaged her aching back. "That's the plan," Caleb replied. "You're growing a whole human being inside you. The least I can do is make you comfortable." "I love you," Eleanor said, not for the first time but meaning it just as deeply. "I love you too," Caleb answered. Both of you. The baby came on a cold morning in late February, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Eleanor woke before dawn with a dull ache in her back that she initially dismissed as the usual discomfort of late pregnancy. But within an hour, the ache had sharpened into distinct pains that came and went in regular waves, and she knew. Caleb, she said, shaking him awake, the baby's coming. He was up and moving instantly, his face pale but determined. I'll get Sarah and the midwife. Don't move, don't do anything. I'll be right back. Caleb, you can't tell me not to move or do anything. The baby doesn't care what you tell me to do. Despite her pain, Eleanor found herself laughing at his panic. Just go quickly, and don't fall off your horse in your hurry. He was back within an hour with both Sarah and Martha Garrett, who served as the local midwife. By then, Eleanor's pains were coming closer together, each one taking her breath away. Martha examined her efficiently and nodded. First baby, so it'll take a while, but everything looks good. Your body knows what to do, Eleanor. You just have to trust it and breathe through the pain. Easier said than done. As the hours wore on and the pains intensified, Eleanor understood why women spoke of labor in hushed, reverent tones. This was work of the most primal kind, her body doing something it was designed to do, but that nonetheless pushed her to the very edge of endurance. Sarah held one hand, Caleb the other, both murmuring encouragement. Martha gave orders in her calm, competent way, and Eleanor tried to follow them even when all she wanted to do was scream. Between contractions, she thought about her mother, wished desperately that Catherine could be here to see this, to meet her grandchild. She's here, Eleanor gasped during one of the brief respites. Mama's here, I can feel her. I know, Sarah said gently. She wouldn't miss this for anything. The labor lasted through the day and into the evening. As darkness fell and the pains grew unbearable, Eleanor began to understand why women sometimes died in childbirth. Her body felt like it was being torn apart, like she couldn't possibly survive this, like, push now, Martha commanded. Big push, Eleanor. Your baby's almost here. Eleanor pushed with everything she had, feeling something shift and give way, and then Martha was saying, again, one more, you can do this. And Eleanor pushed again and felt a tremendous release, heard a thin wail that made her heart stop and restart all at once. It's a girl, Martha announced, her voice full of satisfaction. A perfect, healthy girl. She placed the baby on Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature squalling against her skin and felt her entire world reorient itself around this new person. Her daughter, hers and Caleb's, a whole new life, warm and real and miraculous. Hello, little one, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm your mama, and that man crying beside me, that's your papa. We've been waiting for you. Caleb was indeed crying, unashamed tears running down his weathered cheeks as he reached out to touch his daughter's tiny hand. Her fingers curled instinctively around his, and he made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She's perfect, he said. Eleanor, she's absolutely perfect. They named her Catherine Marie Monroe, called her Kate from the beginning. She had Caleb's gray eyes and Eleanor's dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire ranch when she was displeased. Eleanor fell into motherhood the way she'd fallen into ranching, awkwardly at first, uncertain, but learning quickly and finding unexpected joy in the work. The sleepless nights were hard, the constant demands exhausting, but every time Kate smiled or cooed or reached for Eleanor with her tiny hands, it felt worth it. This was what Catherine had wanted. Life continuing, love multiplying, the house filled with something more than silence. Spring brought the roses Eleanor had planted into full bloom, their pink petals unfurling in the warm sunshine. Eleanor carried Kate outside to see them, holding her daughter carefully as they stood beside Catherine's grave. This is your grandmother, Eleanor told the baby, who was too young to understand but seemed to listen anyway. She died before you were born, but she knew you were coming. She was so happy about it. And I think she'd love you so much, almost as much as I do. Kate gurgled and reached for a rose petal, her small hand opening and closing on empty air. Eleanor caught the petal as it fell and pressed it between Kate's fingers, guiding her to feel its softness. Caleb found them there an hour later, mother and daughter sitting in the grass among the roses, Eleanor talking to Kate about Catherine, about Boston, about all the things Eleanor wanted her daughter to know about the grandmother she'd never meet. Telling her stories? Caleb asked, settling beside them. She should know where she came from, Eleanor said. Know that she's part of something bigger than just us. That her grandmother was brave and kind and loved her even before she existed. We'll make sure she knows, Caleb promised. Every year we'll tell her the story. How a desperate woman and her dying mother stepped off a stagecoach in the middle of nowhere. How a lonely rancher made a choice that changed everything. How love grew in unexpected soil. Eleanor leaned against him, Kate cradled between them, and looked out over the land that had become home. The ranch that had seemed so foreign a year and a half ago now felt like it had always been hers. She knew every rock and tree, every shift in the wind, every sound the animals made. She knew the neighbors and their stories, knew who to trust and who to avoid. She knew how to plant and harvest, how to preserve food for winter, how to read the sky for weather. She belonged here. Finally, completely, she belonged. Do you ever regret it? She asked Caleb. Taking us in that day? Your life would have been simpler if you'd sent us back. Simpler, Caleb agreed, but emptier. Eleanor, you gave me everything I didn't know I was missing. Purpose and partnership and this. He touched Kate's downy head with infinite gentleness. This perfect little person. No, I don't regret it. Not for a single second. The years that followed proved him right. They had 2 more children, a son they named Daniel and another daughter they called Rose. The ranch prospered, and Caleb eventually built an addition to the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper dining room. Eleanor started a small school, teaching the ranch children and any others who could make the journey, honoring her mother's belief in the power of education. Grace Kimball married a traveling photographer and moved to Denver, but visited every summer with her growing family. Sarah Chen became Kate's godmother and taught all the Monroe children to speak basic Chinese. Even Mrs. Kimball mellowed over the years, eventually admitting that perhaps Eleanor had been good for Caleb after all. But Eleanor's favorite times were still the quiet evenings on the porch, after the children were asleep and the day's work was done. She and Caleb would sit together watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, both of them content in the comfortable silence of a partnership that had weathered everything life threw at it. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked one evening in August, 10 years almost to the day from when Eleanor had first arrived. About how far we've come, Eleanor said. How much has changed? That first day, when I stepped off the stage and saw the look on your face, I was so sure you'd send us away, so certain that this was just another door closing, another rejection. I was thinking the same thing, Caleb admitted, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. You weren't what I expected. No? No. You were better, braver, stronger, everything I needed without knowing I needed it. He kissed the top of her head. Best decision I ever made, keeping you. Best decision I ever made staying, Eleanor replied. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged, brilliant and infinite overhead. From inside the house came the sound of Daniel crying, quickly followed by Rose's voice soothing her younger brother. Kate would be reading by lamplight in the room she shared with her sister, losing herself in whatever book Grace had sent from Denver. This was Eleanor's life now, not the one she'd imagined as a girl in Boston, dreaming of grand adventures and romantic love, but something better, something real and solid and earned through hard work and sacrifice and choices made in difficult moments. She thought about her mother often, especially on nights like this when the world felt perfect and whole. Catherine would have loved to see this, her grandchildren thriving, her daughter happy, the life they'd both worked so hard to build flourishing in ways they'd barely dared imagine. Thank you, Mama, Eleanor whispered to the night, for everything, for being brave enough to come west, for believing in me, for knowing that Caleb was exactly what I needed even when I didn't know it myself. A warm breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of roses and sage, and Eleanor chose to believe it was her mother's answer. A reminder that love doesn't end with death, that the people we lose remain with us in the choices we make, and the lives we build and the stories we tell. Kate appeared in the doorway, her nightgown glowing white in the darkness. Mama? Papa? Can you tell me the story again? About how you met? Eleanor and Caleb exchanged a smile. This had become a ritual, Kate's favorite bedtime story, though she'd heard it dozens of times. "Come here, little bird," Eleanor said, making room between herself and Caleb. Kate settled into the space, warm and solid and wonderfully real. Eleanor wrapped an arm around her daughter and began the story she would tell for the rest of her life, the story that would be passed down through generations. It was a hot August day in 1879, and I stepped off a stagecoach into a future I couldn't possibly imagine. Your grandmother was with me, sick and frightened, and we had nowhere else to go. But there was a man waiting, your papa. And when he looked at us, really looked at us, he made a choice, the kind of choice that changes everything. She told it all, the fear and the hope, the grief and the healing, the slow building of love from the foundation of kindness. Kate listened raptly, though she knew every word, and when Eleanor finished, the girl sighed with satisfaction. "I'm glad Papa chose to keep you," Kate said. "So am I, sweetheart," Eleanor replied. "So am I." Long after Kate had gone back to bed, Eleanor and Caleb remained on the porch, unwilling to let go of the peace of the evening. The land stretched out before them, dark and familiar, holding all their history and all their hopes. "Do you think we've done right by them?" Eleanor asked. "The children, I mean, given them the kind of life they deserve?" "I think we've given them the most important things," Caleb said. "Love and security and a home that will always be here for them. The rest they'll figure out on their own, just like we did." Eleanor nodded, knowing he was right. Their children would face their own challenges, make their own choices, build their own lives. But they would do it from a foundation of love and belonging that Eleanor and Caleb had worked so hard to create. "I love you," Eleanor said, the words as natural as breathing after 10 years of marriage. "I love you too," Caleb replied. "Thank you for stepping off that stagecoach. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting us stay," Eleanor said. "For seeing past the burden to the possibility, for choosing kindness when it mattered most." They sat together as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something extraordinary from the wreckage of desperation. The ranch would outlast them, would pass to their children and their children's children. But the love that had built it, the choice Caleb had made on a dusty platform, the courage Eleanor had shown in accepting that choice, that would last forever. In the years to come, when Kate was grown with children of her own, she would bring them to the ranch and tell them the story of their great-grandmother Catherine, who died knowing her daughter was safe and loved. She would show them the roses that bloomed every spring beside Catherine's grave, pink and perfect and enduring. And she would tell them about the day her mother stepped off a stagecoach and into a future built on one man's unexpected kindness. Because some stories deserve to be remembered, some choices echo through generations, and some lives, no matter how they begin, are transformed by the simple act of someone choosing love over fear, generosity over self-interest, and hope over certainty. Eleanor and Caleb Monroe understood this truth in their bones, lived it every day, and passed it down to their children as the most valuable inheritance of all. Not land or money or material possessions, but the knowledge that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as burdens. That sometimes the people who seem like complications turn out to be exactly what you need. And that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, one choice made in a single heartbeat can change the course of your entire life. As the stars wheeled overhead and the New Mexico night wrapped around them like a benediction, Eleanor closed her eyes and offered one final prayer of gratitude. For her mother, who'd given her life and love and the courage to survive anything. For Caleb, who'd given her home and partnership and children who filled the house with joy. And for the journey that had brought her here, difficult as it had been, because every step had been necessary to lead her exactly where she belonged. The wind stirred the cottonwoods, rustling their leaves in a sound like applause or blessing. And somewhere in that wind, Eleanor could have sworn she heard her mother's voice, proud and loving and infinitely pleased. "Well done, my darling girl. Well done."